Well, hello, I'm Bill Bullard, RCAP USA CEO, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening. And also want to thank those of you who watched last week's first ever Facebook Live meeting that we did. And so I want to recap because last week we had over 31,000 views of our presentation and over 800 questions and comments. And so there was no way we could get through all of the questions and comments. So our plan was that we would go through those today. But there has been so many things happening in our industry just in the last week that we thought it appropriate to talk to you about the more current events. So if you recall, last week we talked about the severe challenges that our industry is facing. You know, we're probably in the worst situation today than our industry has been in the past 30 or 40 years. We have producers who have cattle ready to market and no market to market their cattle into. We have cattle that are on show lists that have been on there for 2 weeks without a bid. This is a serious situation, and we have to address it. And of course, there are a number of different efforts underway, including those of a bill passed by Congress that allocated $9.5 billion to help livestock producers and dairy producers and other farmers. So that effort is underway. But what we're really seeing in our industry is that our markets are fundamentally broken. We see that there has been empty grocery store shelves of beef. And that indicates to us that the supply chain and the distribution chain and the entire competitive structure of our industry needs a massive overhaul. And I think that this situation is certainly shining a glaring light on the deficiencies within our industry. So now, more than any time in the past, now is the time to take the corrective actions necessary to preserve a competitive marketplace so you and your children and your grandchildren can continue to market your cattle into a competitive marketplace. So we said that we had gone through triage to decide what are the two issues that we need Congress to address immediately in order to restore the opportunity to earn a competitive income from a competitive marketplace. And we said we've narrowed it down to two. And those two include, number one, we have to give our US producers the ability to compete in their own domestic market by distinguishing their higher quality beef with a born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States of America label. We must restore mandatory country of origin labeling so US producers can compete in their own domestic marketplace. The second thing we need to do is we need to fix the broken market itself. And we've identified for many years, one of the problems or the most significant problem in our industry is we've lost confidence in our most important price discovery market. It's the holy grail of the cattle industry. It's the fed cattle market. That's the market upon which all cattle are essentially based in terms of their price. And so we've seen a significant erosion in that cash market for many years. And we've known that. We went back in the early 2000s and we worked with Senator Grassley and others. And Senator Grassley introduced what was called the Spot Market Protection Bill. And that bill would have required the largest of meat packers that own more than one plant, to purchase at least 25% of all of their daily slaughter needs from the competitive marketplace. And they were required to kill those cattle within 7 days. So they couldn't convert them into captive supply cattle. So this was an early attempt to try to address the mounting captive supplies that have been thinning our cash market and now have left our cash market at an ultra thin level, too level to convey a truly competitive price in the marketplace. And so we go clear back into the early 2000s as well, when we first passed mandatory country of origin labeling for beef. We also tried to ban packer ownership and control of livestock, but those initiatives were slapped down immediately. And so in the early 2000s, as we were working with Senator Grassley's office in support of the Spot Market Protection Plan, a number of studies have been done with our industry. And Richard Sexton from the University of California, Davis, and another professor did a study, and they concluded in their study that if captive supply levels, meaning if your cash market fell below 50% and captive supply levels were to achieve levels above 50%, then you would expect depressed fed cattle prices in the monopsony arena level. In other words, they would then be subject to extreme market power by the consolidated and concentrated meat packers. So way back then, we realized that if we allowed the cash market to fall below 50%, then our industry's marketplace itself was vulnerable to the market power exerted by the handful of large meat packers. And so what I'd like to do is show you a chart, because as we've been working with Senator Grassley's office and others right now, trying to reintroduce this legislation, the question remains is what is the appropriate level to set that cash market so that we will truly restore the competitiveness of our industry and truly insulate that most important cash market from being manipulated or otherwise distorted due to various problems, such as the crisis we find ourselves in today. And so what we did, because we weren't certain as to what the level had to be, we were relying upon the Sexton study that said it had to be over half if you wanted to maintain and insulate the marketplace from that kind of behavior. And so we had developed some charts that I'd like to show you. And we're going to start with chart number 1, if I can find it. There it is. So what I'm showing you here is what has happened with our cash market volume over the years, starting back in 2002. So here, if you can see my cursor at the left, here we start in the latter part of 2002, and we have captive supply levels at about 50%, and they rise in the early part of 2000, and you see this anomaly, this huge drop. Well, that happens to be the week before what is known as the cow that stole Christmas. This was the imported cow detected with mad cow disease on December 23rd. But in any event, as our cash market volume was up over 60% here in the early to mid 2000s, we saw our cash fed cattle prices starting to trend upward here during this period. And during the same period, we see a downward trend in the weekly average cash prices on a volume basis in our industry. And then we see here in the 2010 and 2011 period, we see that our fed cattle prices were responding to the very tight supplies, and they were marching upwards. And as they were marching upwards, the volume in the cash market dropped precipitously during this period. We fell below 40%, below 30%, then hovered around here above 20%. And then we hit this demarcation point, which is January 1 of 2015. Now that happens to be the point in time that we start the antitrust lawsuit that we filed, alleging that since this time, the meat packers have colluded in order to artificially depress prices paid to cattle producers while inflating their own margins and profits. So we know that we hit a historical high in cattle prices here in November of 2014, and then our cattle prices started to fall. Well, before they started to fall, in fact, as they were increasing, we were seeing the packers shift large volumes of cattle out of the cash market and placing them into captive supply arrangements. And then after 2015, we see tremendous volatility in our cattle market, all the while our cash volume remains at about 24% during this 5-year period from 2015 to present. And so we then were asked the question, well, is a 25% floor on fed cattle volume sufficient in order to restore competition at least back to what we had back here? And we're doubtful. In fact, we still rely upon the studies that were done back here that said, don't let that cash market fall below 50%. Otherwise, the market could be subject to the depressed monopsony levels and subject to the tremendous market power exerted by the packers. And so when asked what the right number was, we didn't know, but we certainly know that 24% is way too low. And so we were asked specifically about a 25% level. So what we did was we began to model where our industry has been with respect to the ultra thin cash market that we have now that is accompanied by tremendous volatility in the industry. In fact, what's interesting here is we've had 4 peaks in the livestock prices since 2015, and each subsequent peak is settles less than the one before, which means we're trending downwards in cattle prices. And so what we did was, let me bring up the next chart. I can find it here. Okay, so here what we did is if 25% was too low to restore robust competition in the cash market, we recognized that the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region in the South is the largest cattle procurement region and also the region that has the lowest volume of cash prices. In fact, from 2014 to 2015, the level of the cash volume in that region itself was about 5.5%, so extremely low. So we modeled the scenario of increasing the floor for the cash volume in the largest cattle procurement market in the nation up to 50%. And if we were to have done that back on January 1st of 2015, what would that have done to our cash market? And we see that it in fact has elevated the cash market from where we were. We were at 24% here, but now we're only up about 33% as a result of requiring a 50% floor in the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region. Well, that puts us back, not back when we had over 50% and more robust competition in our industry. That put us back at a period where we were already experiencing a steep decline in the volume of the cash market. In other words, it was growing ultra thin during this period. And so we thought, well, we've got, of the 5 cattle procurement regions, 3 of them are well below the 50% level. The Nebraska region is up in the 40s, and the Iowa, Minnesota region is even higher. But in the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region, which is the lowest, then we have Kansas, which is another large cattle procurement region, was hovering around 19%. And then we've got Colorado that we're unable to get a lot of data from because of the confidentiality provisions in the livestock mandatory price reporting. So we thought, well, let's make another assumption. Let's assume that we would require in both the Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region, as well as the Kansas region, a requirement that the meat packers purchase at least 50% in their marketplace. And that's what we have here. We now, if we had both the southern Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico region, the 2 large regions, and then Kansas, both require to purchase at least a 50% volume in the cash market, we would then elevate the national cash market to about 40%. Again, that does not bring us back to the early 2000s when we were first recognizing the problem and we had the cash market up over 60% here in the early 2000s, and even in 2004 and 5, we were at 55%. So if we were to make the assumption that all of the regions, that all packers in the nation had to procure 50%, we can use this chart as a benchmark because this line represents 50%, and you would simply have a straight line if they were all purchasing at least 50% of the marketplace, and you might have some variations upwards. So if you want to use this chart as such a benchmark, you can look at, here's the 40% line. So if we were to require a 40% level, then we would be restoring our industry back to the 2010 and 9 and 8 period. If we went any lower than that, we fall into this period where our prices were falling, or the volume in the cash market was falling precipitously. Now, importantly, there were other studies done. Back in 2007, when the livestock and meat marketing study was conducted, that was a multi-year study costing millions of dollars. And that was the compromise that Congress struck when they decided they would not pass the ban on packer ownership and control in the 2002 Farm Bill. Instead, they would conduct a study. So they did the study called the Livestock and Meat Marketing Study that was issued in January of 2007. And in that study, they tried to determine what impact on prices would there be if captive supplies increased. And they focused considerably on the hog industry. And they said in the hog industry, if the study showed that if you lowered the price, or excuse me, the study showed that if you increase captive supplies, or which would cause a lowering of the competitive cash market by 1%, you would cause prices to decline by almost 0.9%, so almost a 1-to-1. So if you were to lower the volume of hogs in the cash market by 10%, you would lower the price of hogs by about 9.9%. Now, if you apply that rule of thumb to our industry, now that we're down in the 24 to 30% range, you can see that there's scientific basis for making a determination of what is the right level that we must achieve as an industry if we're serious at all about maintaining the competitiveness of the marketplace. You know, many people said, well, why weren't we enforcing our antitrust laws back during this period? And you recall back in the 2009 and 10 era when the US Department of Justice and the Department of Agriculture jointly conducted workshops. And we had economists like economist Steve Kuntz, who recommended to the Justice Department back when these volumes were shrinking, that his research showed that there was no reason, no justification for any aggressive antitrust enforcement in our US cattle industry. And he said that these increased captive supply arrangements were actually benefiting the packers, and the benefit outweighed the cost that the producer bore as a result of the packer gaining more control over the livestock. So many in our industry resisted any efforts to preserve and protect the cash market, and now we find ourselves in the crisis we're in today. So the question we have to ask ourselves, are we going to be satisfied simply to make some minor tweaks to what we know to be the most serious problem facing our industry today? Or are we going to make it a determination of what is absolutely needed in the industry in order to insulate this most important market from price distortions and any price manipulation that can occur in a highly concentrated marketplace like we have? So that's the question facing us today. And I think it's extremely important that we understand where our industry has been for the past, since the early 2000s, for about 18, 20 years. And you can see that we have an erosion of the supply of cattle procured in the cash market. And as a result, after that period, if we go back, I'm not sure if I can do that quickly, go back to the first chart where we're down here at the 24% level. So the question is, if you raise that by 6 percentage points, would that have a meaningful impact on the industry? And I would say, no, it would bring us back to where we were already on the decline. And so if the industry is serious about restoring competition for themselves, their children, and their grandchildren, then we need to stand firm. We have for far too long been willing to compromise on the basis, well, we just can't get any support for that. We better get support for this, or we won't have an industry left. You know, the hog industry in the late 90s went through a period where they saw their hog prices fall considerably, and they quickly lost a critical mass to maintain a competitive industry within the US hog industry, and we've lost 9 out of 10 hog producers in half a lifetime. That can happen to us if we're not willing to stand up and defend the marketplace itself. And so this is probably the most important issue facing the cattle industry today. And one of the primary purposes that RCAF is providing these charts is because we're trying to trigger some meaningful fact-based debate on what is the level that we must maintain in order to ensure that we have a competitive marketplace. And we've yet to see that, because all the studies were done back here when we had fed cattle procurements in the cash market were well up over 50%. So this is the most important and the most serious issue affecting us today. And it's extremely important. We have to decide as an industry whether we are going to be satisfied with a minor tweak, or if we're really going to dig our heels in the ground and say, you know, our industry is being decimated by a broken market structure that needs to be corrected. And you know as well that RCAF USA realized that this marketplace was broken a long time ago. And in April of 2019, we filed the historic antitrust lawsuit alleging that the four meat packers have in fact conspired in order to artificially depress the prices to producers. So we've initiated a solution to the problem of our antitrust laws and our Packers and Stockyards Act have not been properly implemented and enforced for many years. And yet we're faced with these new crises that need to be addressed right now. And this is the most meaningful thing that the producers could do today, is stand up and say that these captive supplies have harmed the industry. We've known it for a long time. We've tried since the early 2000s to address it. Today, perhaps there is more support than ever before, and we can actually get this job done. And so RCAF's membership has directed us to eliminate the harmful effects of captive supplies. And based on the scientific evidence that we have today, it's very clear to us that the level has to be somewhere over 50%. Perhaps it needs to be higher than that, but we don't know that. We're relying upon the scientific studies that use the 50% as the threshold. And interestingly, you've got the Nebraska cattlemen's in Nebraska, one of the largest cattle feeding states in the nation. And they too have come out asking for at least 50%. And to clarify it, they said in the negotiated cash market and the negotiated cash grid pricing. And so, again, this is extremely, extremely important. And we can't afford to get this wrong. We can't afford to take just small incremental steps to address a huge monumental problem that has been decimating our industry. Now is the time to correct it. So we need your support in order to stand up for what is needed to restore competition in the US cattle market. So with that, let's try to go through some of the questions from last time. And I said there was about 800 comments and questions. So if we were to spend 30 seconds a piece on those, it would take us about 6 hours to go through them. So I want to go through some of the questions because we printed them out and there was a lot of them, of course, that were similar. But one of the questions was, what about imports? What needs to be done about imports? And, you know, we have seen imports steadily increase in the United States. And presently, about 20% of all the available beef supply in the United States is derived either from imported beef or from beef derived from imported cattle. So about 20% of beef in the marketplace is derived from foreign sources. And again, US cattle producers can't compete against that beef because they don't have the ability to distinguish their product with a mandatory country of origin label. And it's the direct result of these imports that we believe that this labeling is more important than ever, because imports can displace domestic production, as we've clearly seen in our US sheep industry. And so the producer needs the ability to build demand for animals, for cattle that are born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States. And that's what country of origin labeling allows them to do. If the American consumers would seek out the USA product, then the meat packers could go to one source and one source only in order to satisfy that consumer demand. They would have to go to the US cattle producer. And unfortunately, the meat packers do not share the cattle producers' desire to build demand for US cattle that are exclusively born and raised in the United States. That is your exclusive economic interest in this multi-segmented beef supply chain. And so we as producers who need the ability, and I say we as a representative of you cattle producers, you need the ability to distinguish your higher quality product in the marketplace so you can begin the process of building demand for cattle that you raise exclusively here in the United States. And only with country of origin labeling can you do that. And that's a huge battle because obviously the meat packers enjoy the opportunity to source cheaper beef from foreign countries and bring it into the US marketplace where it's entitled to receive a USDA safety inspection sticker. And then consumers are led to believe as a result of that inspection sticker that it must be a product of the United States of America. And of course, when we lost mandatory country of origin labeling, we lost a provision that required the imported beef product to maintain its foreign label all the way through retail sale, meaning all the way to the consumer. And now, after the repeal of country of origin labeling, we reverted back to where the meat packers are allowed to simply subject the product to minimal processing, such as unwrapping and rewrapping, and then placing a USA label on it and throwing the foreign label to the side. That's deceptive, and that's certainly harming the economic viability of our US cattle industry. So imports are a huge issue. We're not going to stop imports, but we certainly need to compete against those imports. And I've said earlier that the cattle down in Brazil, for example, they're priced about 40% less than your cattle here in the United States. And you are not operating on a level playing field when you have no ability to compete against that product when it's brought into the US with a USDA inspection sticker on it and sold to the consumer side by side in the grocery store shelf, leading the consumer to believe it's all domestic product when it certainly isn't. So next question is most meat in grocery stores not US. So I just addressed that. About 20% of the available beef supply in the United States is derived from imported sources. And who will regulate the mandatory cash trade if we do get meaningful legislation passed to require the meat packers to source at least 50% of their cattle needs through the competitive cash market? Who will enforce that? Well, it would fall likely under the purview of the US Department of Agriculture and the Packers and Stockyards Division of that agency. And so they would be the enforcement arm, and depending on how the law is written, there might be private enforcement action available to individual producers who wish to try to enforce that on their own if the government regulators don't step forward and do the enforcement. So, you know, we have to have some faith in the system that we have a regulatory agency that will in fact regulate, and that must be the faith we associate with as we move forward in passing this important legislation. Do you have a remedy for the already authorized WTO retaliatory tariffs regarding mandatory country of origin labeling? Well, of course, as the World Trade Organization reviewed the old country of origin labeling law, they found that it discriminated against imported cattle from Canada and Mexico. And the World Trade Organization told the United States, you either have to change or repeal the law, or they're going to grant Canada and Mexico the authorization to retaliate with retaliatory tariffs. And that's exactly what happened, is that Canada and Mexico have been granted the authority to initiate retaliatory tariffs on other goods to the tune of about somewhat over $1 billion. And so the answer to that is, how do you get around that? Well, you don't come back with the very same piece of legislation that the WTO reviewed. In fact, you substantially change the new legislation that would require beef sold in America to be labeled as to where it was born, raised, and slaughtered. And if you address the major criticisms upon which the World Trade Organization's conclusion was based, and that was, they said that there was an undue record-keeping burden on importers. Sometimes the labels were inaccurate, and there was an imbalance between the cost for the importer of having to label the product and the actual benefit that consumers realized, because such a small percentage of the imported product was required to be labeled. And one of the reasons that that occurred is that when they passed the mandatory country of origin labeling law back in 2002, they defined retailer as an entity that sold approximately $230,000 worth of fresh fruits and vegetables. So it completely exempted meat markets, it exempted small grocers, It only required the grocers who sold this level of fruits and vegetables to be subject to the mandatory cool-off. And then on top of that, we exempted all food service establishments, as well as exempted any ingredient to a processed food item. And so if a beef product like a roast was smoked or salted or cooked, it was not required to be labeled. So new legislation can certainly be introduced that would be substantially different than the old legislation that the World Trade Organization had reviewed. And the new legislation could address each of these shortcomings. You know, we don't need to maintain written records in order for the packers to accurately determine which animals were born and raised in the United States. And it's because the animals themselves carry that information with them. It's because we require permanent markings on all imported cattle from Canada and from Mexico. And if we import cattle from Australia, we already have the protocols in place to require them to be permanently marked as well. That means a packer can look at every animal at the packer gate and determine whether or not the animal bears foreign markings. If it does, and if it's walking, it had to have been born and raised at least partially in a foreign country before arriving to the United States. If there are no import markings on the animal, then that animal could be none other than an animal born and raised in the United States that never crossed the border. And so no record keeping is required in order to implement the mandatory country of origin labeling law, but such a requirement was imposed because clearly the US Department of Agriculture never supported the mandatory country of origin labeling law, and they said so. And so we as an industry need to acknowledge the fact that we need to push this because it's good for independent producers and for consumers, even though the regulators don't like it and the meatpacking industry doesn't like it. I talked about the inaccurate labels. They said that the old labels did not distinguish between animals that may have been born and raised in Canada and then brought to the United States and partially raised in the United States and then slaughtered in the United States. So what they wanted was a label that said born and raised, born in Canada, raised in the United States and Canada, and slaughtered in the United States. Well, that doesn't take rocket science to fix that. We can provide the importer, the seller of the imported animal, the right to provide detailed information as to where the animal had been raised and then require the packer to pass that on to the retailer. In fact, you could tell simply from the date upon which the animal was imported. If it was imported more than 2 weeks prior to slaughter, it was also raised in the United States. And then, of course, the third and biggest problem was let's expand the scope of products that would be subject to the cool law and thereby create balance where the World Trade Organization found imbalance. So another question, how are we going to fix the future trading? So our markets are fundamentally broke, a complete disconnect between the value of cattle and the value of beef, and unsurprisingly, a complete disconnect between what's happening in the futures market and what's happening in the cash market. So our position is that we must rebuild and maintain the integrity of the holy grail in our industry, the single marketplace that informs every other aspect of our industry, including the cattle futures market. So we can't expect the cattle futures market to operate properly if it doesn't have a solid competitive benchmark to guide it. And that benchmark, of course, is our broken cash market. And so we need to fix this problem from the ground up. And the ground up means the first thing we need to do is restore the competitiveness of the most important market in our industry. And as you may know, the cattle futures trading platform is a part or is included in our antitrust lawsuit. We've alleged in that lawsuit that because the cattle futures market is informed by the cash market, that anyone that traded any cattle futures or options on the CME cattle futures market was likewise dealing with the market that has, as we alleged, has been manipulated by the meat packers. So yes, we need to fix some significant problems in the cattle futures market. The question is, where do you start? And we firmly believe we have to start at the foundation of our market structure, and that is the cash market. Another question, does the dairy industry have any aspects that could be useful for the beef industry in this effort? The dairy producers have been struggling. We've been losing dairy farms, particularly up in the Wisconsin region. And one of the fallouts of this coronavirus is we read reports about dairy farmers dumping their milk. They're dumping their milk because the distribution system is plugged up and unable to carry the product on to retail outlets. We're seeing the same thing happening in the produce industry. And now, when many of you are out fighting the vagaries of weather to keep your livestock safe and healthy and alive, your corporate counterparts in the hog and poultry industries have been sitting around over the weekend deciding how to kill cattle, how to kill hogs and chickens. And so now we're hearing reports of them euthanizing chickens in these big industrialized complexes. That has to be a signal to us that we're on the wrong track as a nation, that we've allowed our entire food distribution system to run amok, and we have lost sight completely of the need to strengthen and support the family farm system of agriculture that has become the envy of the world, bar none, and our ability to continue producing in the most efficient and effective and environmentally friendly manner a wholesome, high quality and affordable food supply. The dairy industry is suffering from the same conditions that we're suffering from here during this crisis. I don't know the detail about the dairy pricing structure. What I know is that the price of milk for many, many years has been below the cost of production, causing the decline in the number of dairy farmers. So another question. When I talk to Cattlemen's Association, they give me vague answers that they support voluntary labels and cite the USDA study that said that the mandatory country of origin labeling law cost billions of dollars, and there was no evidence that the consumers even cared where their beef came from. Really. We have a new president who initiated an executive order early in his term and said, we need to begin buying American and we need to begin hiring American because we need to begin strengthening our domestic supply chains, and we need to stop our reliance upon foreign supply chains, in particular China. And so for several years now, we've been moving our entire country in a new direction, far away from where we've been over the past 25 years. And the fundamental understanding there is that you can't maintain a strong economy if you don't maintain the supply chains here. And in the food industry, the supply chain begins with the family farmers and ranchers. And so what the president wants America to do and what America needs to do is to begin supporting the domestic supply chains. And so if country of origin labeling did nothing except give the consumer an opportunity for those who want to choose to support the American family farmer and rancher, it is certainly worth the cost. And I'd certainly like to know among cattle producers, how many of you incurred any cost whatsoever when mandatory country of origin labeling was in place, partially in place beginning in March of 2009, fully implemented in May of 2013, and then repealed in December of 2015. So the cost was not a cost that cattle producers bore. You, in some instances, signed affidavits. You left them with your auction yards. You gave them to the cattle buyer. The affidavit says that you are selling animals that are exclusively born and raised in the United States. And unless you tell them otherwise, that's the mode of operation that you're operating in. That certainly didn't cause you to incur any costs. So the cost, of course, was the meat packers, because they had to distinguish the product and allow consumers to exercise choice in the marketplace. It's what's called the cost of competition, because competition cannot occur if the consumer, who has to start the demand forces in the supply chain, if the consumer cannot initiate a demand signal through their buying practices in the grocery store, you cannot have competition. And so whatever cost the packers would bear as a result of enabling consumers to initiate consumer demand for products, that is the cost of competition. And it is not a cost borne by the producer, but the producer has the benefit of being able to create demand for animals that are born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States. So what's interesting about the study is they simply couldn't find evidence that consumers really cared where their meat came from. But we have sufficient evidence from, go talk to any consumer and ask them if they kind of like to know whether their beef was produced under the US food safety regime, or if they want their beef produced under the Costa Rican food safety regime, or Brazilian, which has been known to try to ship tainted product into the supply chain. And so this is really a no-brainer. And you have to think about, why would they fight this issue so hard if this issue didn't provide them tremendous advantage in the marketplace over you, the domestic cattle producer? So next question, how do you feel about Walmart getting involved in the cattle market? Well, you know, we have Walmart trying to vertically integrate the cattle industry. And if Walmart were if there was only one entity in the industry that was doing this, and you still had robust competition and producers could choose whether or not to participate in that kind of a vertically integrated supply chain, then it may not be so bad. But what we're really seeing is we're seeing the components of the model that the meat packers have already perfected in both the poultry and the hog industry. Those components are now being applied in the cattle industry. And that's what this Walmart vertical integration program represents. It represents a new trajectory for the industry, that we're heading in a direction that is going to limit, if not eliminate, opportunities for producers, because there's one very important thing to know about vertical integration. Vertical integration kills competition. You can't have competition if you eliminate all of the competitive marketing channels between the seed stock producer, cow-calf producer, backgrounder, stocker, feeder, and ultimately the fed cattle market. And so this is a dangerous course for the US cattle industry to be on. It's one that we need to prevent from occurring on any larger scale. In fact, we would support dismantling that kind of a vertical integration system within our industry. So what is the fastest way to get the mandatory cash market back? Well, the fastest way is for producers to stand shoulder to shoulder and say, we know what we need. We've compromised for far too many years. As a result of all those compromising, our markets are broken and we're not going to stand for it anymore. And then we go together to Congress and say, this is what the cattle industry needs. Help us help rebuild America. And we can do that by rebuilding the foundations of rural America. And that is what all of you in the cattle industry represent. We're the key to rebuilding prosperity in America, but it isn't going to happen unless cattle producers realize that the meat packers are not going to support our positions. Some of these large formula feeders that have sweetheart deals with the packers are not going to support our positions. We're going to have to dig our heels in the ground and fight. And we hope that the many, many producers will join with us in that fight, because we don't have a choice. We must restore competition in this industry. We must restore the opportunity for aspiring farmers and ranchers to get into this industry, and they simply will not do that if we don't provide them with pricing signals that they can pencil out and bring to their lender that shows that they can be profitable within the industry. So what politicians are on our team? Who stands out as leaders for beef? You know, that's the most frustrating part of the last 2 decades, is that there's only been a handful of senators and members of Congress willing to stand up for the American farmer and rancher. I have mentioned Senator Chuck Grassley, for example, and he has tried many times to reform the broken marketplace, only to be slapped down by the multinational meatpacking lobby. We have other senators who have joined ranks with him in the past. Senator Mike Enzi from Wyoming, Senator John Tester from Montana, for example. We have many senators who have left the Senate who were champions of the US cattle industry, Senator Tim Johnson from South Dakota. And so now it's worse than pulling teeth to get a cattle state member of Congress to stand up for the cattle industry. And that's a hugely disappointing fact of life. So it's up to us to build those champions, to educate them as to the need for them to help us help America. And the only way to do that is to give us our markets back and give us the ability to compete in those markets. And so here very recently, and in fact now and for the past 2 weeks, we've been working with several senators' office and several House members' office from Iowa, from South Dakota, from Montana, from Arkansas, excuse me, and from the state of Washington. And so those are the states where members have stepped forward and said, we want to know what we can do to help. And so we need to be more aggressive. Each and every one of us needs to be contacting our members of Congress. And if you can set up a meeting with your member, I'd be happy to join on that call to talk about some of the historical background that's important for them to begin to dismiss all of the misinformation that they've been receiving for years. And that information in a nutshell essentially is whatever is good for the meat packers is good for the producers because the money will trickle downward. And that's the message that Congress has heard for far too long. It is absolutely false. The cattle producer is not involved in the same industry as the beef producer. There is a demarcation point at the point where the cattle is actually converted into beef. And at that point, there is a divergence of the economic and financial interests of the various participants along those two separate but cooperative, if you will, supply chains. We're dependent on each other, but we should be fiercely competing with each other in order to achieve our respective economic interests in the industry. Why doesn't the Federal Trade Commission get involved in the control now exerted over the packer industry? You know, the Federal Trade Commission was very much involved in our industry back in the 1920s. In fact, it was the action by the Federal Trade Commission that actually caused the Packers and Stockyards Act to be passed and the consent decree that was signed back in 1920. But since that time, the Federal Trade Commission, like the other regulatory agencies, have essentially maintained a laissez-faire, hands-off approach in the market. Whatever ills occur in the marketplace will self-correct. So just sit tight and things will be better tomorrow. However, the Federal Trade Commission did reach out to us and we had a meeting with them it's been a couple of years now, but they've expressed an interest in revisiting the issues that are of importance to cattle producers. So we're hopeful that we can continue working with the Federal Trade Commission to address some of these issues. Well, COVID-19 infections being reported in the packing plants helped to bring visibility to the consolidation and risks associated. Well, we think that's exactly what is happening right now. I think our cattle producers and other livestock producers should be appalled at our inability to meet the needs of this nation, even in a time of crisis. I explained last time that we once had a very robust system that was insulated from crises that occurred in one locality or even in regions. And that's because we had more producers, we had many more feedlots, we had many more packers, we had many more local auction yards, and all of these represented our national security interests. It represented our ability as an industry to withstand the shocks of weather crises, disease crises like we're faced with now, or other types of crises. We've lost all of that because we've given up our entire food industry to the multinational corporations to shape it the way they want to. And they have. They've shaped it in a manner that best benefits them, without respect, without regard to the impact that that has had on rural America, without regard to the impact that that has had on our national security interests. And we firmly believe that this is an awakening for the United States of America, now realizing how vulnerable our food system is because we've lost sight of the need to maintain a disaggregated, widely dispersed food production, food processing, and food distribution system in the United States. How does the formula contract versus the cash market work? So that's a good question. So the cash market is the market where the buyer and seller negotiates the price through a bid offering and bid acceptance or an alternative bid. You have two buyer and seller negotiating to arrive at a price for livestock. Well, what we have seen in our industry and why our cash market is now shrunk to ultra thin levels, too thin to predict a competitive price. Well, that happened because the meat packers have shifted large volumes of cattle out of this cattle market and placed them primarily in what are formula contracts. So formula contracts are a commitment by the producer to deliver the cattle to the packer when they're ready for slaughter. And in return, the packer agrees to a formula that will be applied to determine what the price of those cattle are. So if cattle are delivered this week to a meat packer under a formula contract, and they're slaughtered next week, typically the packer will look to this week when the cattle were actually delivered to determine what the average weighted price was under livestock mandatory price reporting. In other words, what was the price that was determined in the cash market? And that's the price that becomes the base price for all of those formula cattle. So the difference between a cash price and a formula price is that a cash price is negotiated between buyer and seller, and the price is known when the negotiation is over. A formula price is an unpriced commitment to deliver cattle to the packer with the price to be determined on whatever the cash market was the week before delivery, typically. So that's the difference between the two marketplaces. So how much beef supply do we have, frozen meat, and how long will that last? Well, we knew in 2015 when we quadrupled the imports from Australia from 2014 and 15, and much of that beef was going into our cold storage. And so we've been watching cold storage here of late. And so the 5-year average has been just under 500 million pounds of beef in cold storage. If you add all the beef together, it's over 2 billion pounds. That would be beef and pork and lamb and chicken, for example. So how much would that, how long will that last? Not very long. We produce approximately 25 billion pounds of beef a year, and we consume a little bit over that, about 26 to 27 billion pounds of beef. So the average consumption in the United States, based on our population of 329 million, is about 58 pounds per person. So if you've got a calculator, you can figure out, divide 500 million pounds by 58 pounds, and you know how many people could eat beef for a year if all we had to rely upon was what was in cold storage. Other question. How do we articulate to the government in one voice with so many different associations with differing views? Well, very good question. The way to do that is if there truly are differing views. rather than differing constituencies, then you have a problem. But in our industry, we have the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, who includes among their constituency the beef packers themselves. And then you have RCAF USA, the largest producer-only cattle association in the United States. And we exclusively represent the interests of our farmer and rancher members who sell and raise and sell live cattle. And so we expect there to be a divergence of interests because we represent different constituencies. And in addition to that, RCAF is bound by its membership policies. Our voting members, meaning everyone that owns cattle that's a member of RCAF, receives a mail-in out ballot, and they get to vote on our policies. And that provides us the direction for all of the actions that we take on behalf of the cattle industry is directed directly by our members. We're not going to compromise that. If another organization wants to come up with a weaker position than us, we've seen that before, we're not going to go there. We're going to fight for our members' interests, what they've directed us to do, and what we know is absolutely needed for our industry. We're not in the business of compromising, particularly today. We have the best opportunity to change the direction of this industry than we have ever had. Now is the time to stand strong with fact-based information as to what is needed in order to restore competition for our industry. And we're going to fight until we win. And that's what we must do. So another question. Does it require legislation to close our border to imports? Generally, yes. However, in the event of a disease outbreak, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is charged with preventing the introduction of and spread within of foreign animal diseases. And that's why it was the act of the U.S. Department of Agriculture that closed the border back in 2003 when mad cow disease was first detected in Canada. And we ended up litigating that issue because after they closed the border, they wanted to reopen it right away. And we argued in court that it was premature to reopen the border while Canada was still working to get its BSE problem under control. So in some instances, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has the authority to do that. And in fact, with respect to the borders themselves, the USDA views our relationship with foreign countries as an open border relationship here in the United States. So their default position is an open border. Now, early in that answer, I said that generally speaking, the Congress would have the authority to do that. We've asked Congress to do that. Back in the 2009 era, when USDA first proposed to allow raw beef from Argentina and from Brazil, we asked Congress to intervene and to block USDA from opening our border to that beef. And so there was introduced what was called the Foot and Mouth Disease Protection Bill. And that bill would have prohibited the importation of raw beef from any country that wasn't free of foot and mouth disease without vaccination. And unfortunately, we were unable to get that bill passed too. So there's a shared responsibility for the borders, but Congress has delegated to the U.S. Department of Agriculture tremendous authority regarding the borders. And we believe that the USDA has been irresponsible in systematically relaxing our health and safety standards needed to protect our industry from very pernicious foreign animal diseases, particularly in Brazil, where the government itself has a history of being a bad actor in not disclosing disease outbreaks in that country. So now we've hit the 8:01, and I know we started a little bit after 8, but I want to stop here because I know your time is very valuable to you. I appreciate you sharing your time with us. Particularly on Facebook, and you see we've got members who are talking about their operations on Facebook. We welcome you to do the same. And most importantly, it takes numbers. We need you to support what we're doing. We need you to stand with us shoulder to shoulder. We intend to win this battle. We will win this battle. We're going to win our markets back. And we want you to standing with us, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, because we know we're going to do it. And we want you to help us do it quicker than we would otherwise be able to get the job done. So we may do this again next week. We'll see how the response is to this, this evening's presentation. But God bless everybody. Stay safe. Take care of your cattle. And we'll visit with you soon. Thank you and good night.